Hi, I'm Jack Brewer with Expanding Frontiers Research, and welcome to the first meeting of the Wayward Sons Book Group. We will be exploring my nonfiction book, Wayward Sons, NICAP and the IC. We'll be listening to audio recordings and then stopping periodically to discuss the recordings and the material explored. I'm joined by an interesting group of people with background and experience in the UFO topic, in writing and making videos and podcasts. But I'd also like to consider as we begin that the book really isn't about UFOs. It's UFOs had to be in there in order for the book and the events depicted in the book to happen. But I'll defer to, I saw a new video made by James Carrion where he mentioned that even though he was making a video about media and people involved in the UFO shenanigans, it really wasn't about UFOs. It becomes about government, about geopolitics. Tanner, I see you nodding in agreement because that Tanner Boyle is here. He writes the Getting Spooked blog. Could I get you to comment on that a little to get us started, Tanner?
Well, sure, I guess, Jack. I mean, you know this as well as I do, that uh, it's not only like geopolitical stuff, it's some of the best UFO writing you'll find just has a pretty decent grounding in history. And might I say that's why I enjoyed Wayward Sons and wanted to be a part of this book group because, it's somewhat rare that it kind of has that historian's tendency within books like this. Although I think it's becoming more common, thankfully.
Thank you. And Jeff is here. He's a UFO archivist and I would say as expert as people get on the topic. Some Allison and Sharon, I'm glad y'all are here. Thank you. Stephen Greenstreet from the New York Post. He is a video producer and writer at the New York Post, and I appreciate him being here as well as all of you. So we'll start with the introduction to Wayward Sons. Wayward Sons, NICAP and the IC. Introduction. The significance of the NICAP story is subjective. Like many historical sagas, it depends on who you ask as to what it meant, and in some cases, what even happened. Select events can be established from records and archives, and we will certainly examine them. But the fact remains people have differing ideas about what was most important and most interesting about the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena. It is notable that the NICAP saga may be viewed in at least two contexts. One, which is my interest, is the organization's intersection with the intelligence community. A second and more commonly viewed context is NICAP UFO investigation. People interested in UFOs understandably want to know if the group learned anything important. The investigators of NICAP sure thought so, but dissecting the situation leads us to the paradox of the matter. The story of NICAP and what is most significant about it is not so easily discerned. Did NICAP do some good work? Yes, it did. Were NICAP investigators credulous? Yes, that's true too, depending on specific circumstances considered. Was NICAP a CIA front? That might be accurate as well, short-lived and or intermittent as it may have been. Did NICAP rattle swords with the CIA and Air Force about a UFO cover-up? Yep, it certainly did. Was the CIA monitoring NICAP? It sure appears so, to more and less extents and depending on the particular circumstances. Did the CIA dismantle NICAP? Maybe so, or at the least, it is true that CIA associates did basic managerial work for NICAP throughout its lifespan and stages of decline. Did NICAP run itself in the ground through financial mismanagement? Yes, to an extent it did indeed, which also means the CIA was not fully responsible for its demise, at least not necessarily. Much like the parable of the blind man and the elephant, many perspectives are correct to some extent, depending on how one comes at it. Many feel NICAP was derailed by the Central Intelligence Agency. Perceived motives often include thwarting UFO investigation and destabilizing the group's effort to challenge the Condon Report, which was an Air Force-sponsored assessment that minimized the saucer situation. The presence of CIA associates in the saga is clear enough, but motives are much less so. We will consider the circumstances along with the perspectives of those familiar with the events. I actually came to strongly suspect the CIA was substantially involved in the incorporation and initial operation of NICAP. We will explore this in detail on the coming pages. Ironically, I am not convinced the situation significantly impaired or even particularly affected the way Major Donald Kehoe would run the outfit for the next 13 years. During his tenure, there was some overt CIA interest in NICAP activities, as well as some possible not so overt interest. The activities of CIA psychological warfare specialist and NICAP Board of Governors member Colonel Joseph Bryan III will be explored, as will profiles of his intelligence colleagues from the Office of Policy Coordination. We will examine those situations along with some surrounding spectacles that found their ways into a NICAP orbit. A focus of this book is NICAP's relation to the intelligence community, particularly the CIA and FBI. We will draw upon documents obtained through the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, newspaper clippings, and many more cited sources. Much of the material referenced was obtained from records published on the websites of intelligence agencies or by submitting my own requests under the FOIA. As of this writing, several FOIA requests remain open. I will post the material at my blog, The UFO Trail, as it is received. Another primary source for information covered in this book was NICAP files provided by researcher and archivist Barry Greenwood. I am tremendously grateful to him for supplying the material. A 69 MB folder provided by Mr. Greenwood consists of 42 PDFs containing NICAP records. It may be accessed in whole on Google Drive or as individual files I will reference and link, as will be the case with many additional sources. I apologize in advance for the errors which will inevitably inhabit this offering. I hope we find them few, far between, and of minimal consequence. I am thankful to all who helpfully fielded my questions, provided material, and assisted me in reaching people of interest. I also thank all the researchers whose work and materials are cited. Select archives played key roles as well, and I am grateful to their administrators for their valuable assistance. Thanks to those who maintain intelligence agency online reading rooms, I am grateful to the FBI, NARA, CIA, NSA, U.S. Air Force, and the many FOIA officers at several agencies who filled my requests, informed me when no material was available, conducted correspondence, and continue to process records pertaining to this saga. Their work is important and appreciated. I am grateful to the friends, loved ones, and acquaintances who supported this effort. Your messages, encouragement, and phone calls are important to me. Thank you. I am grateful to you for joining me on an exploration of events beginning some 70 years ago. Thanks for coming along. In doing so, we will hopefully catch a meaningful glimpse or three of what took place. I trust you will share the interest I develop and find that the circumstances from years gone by tend to shed light on more recent events. That was actually the primary thing that turned my exploration of NICAP from a couple of blog posts or a podcast into a book. Was I knew UFOs and the UFO genre pretty well, yet I was surprised at what I found about how many similarities there were between what happened with NICAP in the 1950s and 1960s, the end of the 1950s and end of the 60s, as what I was seeing happen with To the Stars Academy. And that seemed like something to go into further. That's when professional journalists, Congress members, people start paying attention when they have verified intelligence officers and verifiable members of the intelligence community saying outrageous things in public. Comments?
This is separate, but are you still finding that your FOIA requests go smoothly or as smooth, or has there been any difference?
That is a good question. It has been hit and miss in the last year. Sometimes it has even been better than it was under the previous administration, like as far as dealing with, I primarily deal with the FBI and the National Archives, which I refer to as NARA, the National Archives and Records Administration. And at times they became like super efficient. And then at other times I might go weeks that I don't get even an acknowledgement of a request. So it's been hit and miss. As long as I'm on the topic, I will say that another motive for doing this group was that I have received records that were requested when I first wrote the book 5 and 6 years ago. And I'll be putting those in the video description, linking to them as we go through the episodes and the blog posts and the documents themselves and things like that. Any other comments or questions?
Yeah, Jack, for me, reading your book was eye-opening because having been familiar with the classic NICAP stories and tales, I had always questioned the role of the CIA in NICAP, and certainly the role in its demise ultimately. But yours always, your book raised the question of, the possibility of the CIA being in there from the beginning, in some form or fashion. Most certainly key players. But yeah, and also the stark lines that were drawn between NICAP, and like you said, and TTSA, and the kind of 2017 rollout, and the disclosure movement that we've seen in the last decade or so. There's so many similarities. And one of the few things that we can get to maybe help get a better, clearer picture of what's going on is provable, verifiable history like those that you present in this book.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, there are a lot of similarities, and we're going to touch on some of those in the first chapter. And it's a complex topic. Allison and I were discussing this before before the rest of you joined the group tonight, that a lot of nuance is required. And yeah, Steve, like if I was shocked by some of the things I was learning and surprised by some of the similarities, I can empathize with people that don't eat, sleep, and breathe UFO records, would be hard pressed, ill prepared to begin to understand the things that Stephen writes about, that Tanner writes about, that the complexities of the Skinwalker Ranch, the complexities of the To the Stars rollout. Yes. Anyone else with comments or questions?
I have one.
Sure.
General statement. So I read Wayward Sons and the Devil's Chessboard back to back, which is about Alan Dulles, founding of the CIA. And it was pretty, reading those two back to back were pretty illuminating on the pattern of just how unhinged and unchecked the CIA and the intelligence community was in general at its inception. And I viewed, hold on, Lucy, come here. I viewed NICAP kind of like as this like microcosm of how the intelligence community at that time operated, right? So with a lot of the same characters. So I'm looking forward to this.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, the CIA enjoys the reputation of being like a Peter Falk, goofy, inept bunch of bumbling guys. And it's also true that they're really clever and among the best at what they do in the world. Like both things can be true at the same time. There were CIA officers that were full-blown drug addicts that acted like maniacs. And there were some really clever critical thinkers that hired magicians to help them assess circumstances. So, yeah, it is an interesting, complex circumstance in the mid-20th century. And I appreciate the parallels to the Devil's Chessboard. Thank you.
I was just going to say that, well, CIA and NICAP is obviously undisputable, and you get into this, obviously. I think their role in dismantling it is perhaps not as much as some might like to believe. You're well aware there's lots of interpersonal problems with NICAP, lots of managerial problems with NICAP, lots of financial issues with NICAP that I think when it comes down to it, we're ultimately more responsible for its demise. But we can't deny that CIA absolutely was involved and interested in NICAP.
Yeah, and that became the story to me was like there are UFOs, okay? There's stuff people don't know what they saw that's in the sky. There's stuff people don't know what they saw in the woods, in the water, in their houses at night. There's all kinds of unidentified sightings of things. What became of interest to me is there are definitively CIA officers involved in NICAP. So what's that all about? Yeah. And it the more I got into it, the more it depended on who you asked and was a pretty subjective interpretation. Thank you, Jeff.
I just wanted to add one thing, is that Alan Dulles referred to useful idiots that he used and exploited as little mice, his little mice. And I couldn't help but think of Donald Kehoe as a little mouse.
He is perplexing. Kehoe is perplexing indeed. Chapter 1. Oh, disclosure, I hear you call. The 1940s rang in the modern UFO era. Many researchers went on to sincerely believe they had legitimate shots at pulling the UFO sword from the stone. The greatest story involving Earth and space may soon be told, proclaimed an October 1st, 1954 newsletter distributed by CRIFO. That organization was Civilian Research Interplanetary Flying Objects, directed by Leonard Stringfield. The assertion was based on an interview Stringfield conducted with Lieutenant Colonel John O'Mara, described as a deputy commander intelligence in the United States Air Force. The colonel apparently kindly confirmed the existence of flying saucers, leading Stringfield to declare the truth may be bared soon. Spoiler, it wasn't. Stringfield further reported the Air Force planned to cooperate with the public about saucers, and that the public would be taken into confidence. This was believed to be stimulated by recent events. Ain't it always? Stringfield continued. Flying saucers do exist, the colonel told me, and he added, in effect, past contradictions were unfortunate. Stringfield described Colonel O'Mara as wonderfully cooperative, and the officer even gave a thumbs up to the CRIFO newsletter. Asked about the publication, the colonel indicated it was slanted in the right direction. The CRIFO newsletter was shared with me in an email from writer and researcher James Carrion. He found the comparisons interesting to much more recent drums of disclosure as beaten by such outlets as the New York Times. I indeed share the perspective, as we can note many similarities to the ongoing story of the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, ATIP, and those promoting the narrative. Comparisons include recent events were supposedly a tipping point. In the know intelligence community insiders were believed to be aiding the process. The government acknowledged the existence of UFOs. Praise was bestowed upon the writer embracing the narrative, and of course, the ultimate confirmation was to come any day. Members of the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, or NICAP, once believed they too were on the verge of something big. In approximately 1958, literature from the young organization was distributed with a message from its director, Major Donald E. Kehoe. Because of new developments, we expect a break in official UFO secrecy in 1959, it was explained. The general storyline came to be a recurring theme for NICAP and its investigators, many of whom worked diligently in their attempts to facilitate disclosure. It was believed an ample amount of public pressure strategically applied to the right agencies and offices would cause a bean spill. The struggle, progress, and setbacks of disclosure were often publicly reported by the group. As a matter of fact, a tug of war with Uncle Sam pretty much came to define NICAP. In 1961, hopes remained high. A NICAP investigator mailed a letter to a potential UFO witness, enclosing a questionnaire and requesting they fill it out and return it, along with details of the sighting. Such was relatively standard operating procedure. The information that you give may be the link in solving the great UFO mystery, the investigator wrote. The NICAP researcher further explained, I might also add that your sighting of this UFO may prove a point which could affect not only our present generation, but also the generations to come. The letter comes to us from files compiled by the FBI on NICAP. The recipient apparently forwarded it, along with the questionnaire, to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. That was not a particularly unusual thing to do in those days, as Bureau files contained several letters from citizens expressing concern about the NICAP agenda. Letter writers would request Hoover's guidance on their suspicions the UFO group may have had a communist allegiance. This was not exclusive to NICAP by any means, as a variety of factors led the American public to suspect communist sympathies ran rampant in the United States. Hoover's policy towards NICAP was to maintain a neutral public stance, as his response indicates. He or his secretary would typically thank letter writers for their concerns, craft a cordial enough no comment on NICAP, and provide further reading on such topics as how to spot Soviet propaganda. Hoover's response in this particular instance included explaining he would like to be of service, but information contained in FBI files must be maintained as confidential due to regulations of the Department of Justice. Hoover wrote he regretted being unable to answer the inquiry and hoped it would not be interpreted to infer the Bureau either did or did not have the data requested. We're close to it, Major Kehoe declared in 1966 about discovering what flying saucers were. He made the statement towards the end of his appearance on the then popular nationally televised show To Tell the Truth. In 1978, optimism among UFO investigators persisted. Phoenix-based Ground Saucer Watch, GSW, Director William H. Spaulding suggested during a funding appeal published in the organization's April bulletin that UFO answers were obtainable. He wrote, "Now is the time all of us must ask ourselves if we really want to solve the UFO mystery. If you answer yes, then we must ask every member to donate $5, $10, $20 to help defer the expensive legal fees." Spaulding was alluding to legal action directed at targets such as the CIA to obtain what were believed to be revealing UFO documents. In that same bulletin, GSW Director of Research W. Todd Zeckel expressed his confidence in cracking the case. Zeckel told readers, "In order to continue this fight and put enough pressure on government agencies to force them to start telling the truth regarding UFOs, we need substantial donations from each and every member. Moreover, we need help from the general public. After all, these efforts will benefit all of mankind in that the evidence we obtain will once and for all allow us to determine the origin and nature of UFOs. I'll get you the truth. You get me the funds. In Spaulding and Zekel's defense, they and their colleagues actually did, in fact, successfully obtain a substantial amount of government documents pertaining to UFOs. The material just never conclusively established their ultimate suspicions and beliefs about Uncle Sam and saucers. Too bad for Ground Saucer Watch they didn't think of raising funds by throwing a hat in the public securities ring. That's what happened in 2017 at To the Stars Academy of Arts and Science, TTSA. And we'll pause there before we come into this century full on. Another thing Allison and I kind of talked about a little pre-group was I feel like I could have pared down some of this, trimmed it down some, and that I don't need to go into all of these circumstances of futility. Yet I also laughed and said, but I really didn't even like scratch the surface. People not familiar with it really need to understand that there has been a frantic urgency surrounding this topic for like 70 years. Comments, questions?
I was just gonna mention Todd Zekel himself's kind of an interesting character who is really kind of a bit of a fraud as well. It was rumored for many years he was like a CIA. He worked for the CIA. He even claimed to work for the CIA. In reality, he worked, I believe, for a porn store in wherever city he lived in at the time. So like he was never actually a CIA officer. So while they did do a lot of good FOIA work, some of his other personal claims of who he was and his background turned out to be pretty false.
He was.
Did he say a porn store?
Yeah,
he did.
Of course. But like, that's what I'm learning. Just starting out is you'll like I'll read along something Jack sent, and then all of a sudden there'll be this crazy detail. I'm like, oh, okay, where'd that come from?
That actually, dare I say, keeps some of us interested, Sharon, is periodically someone that's a widely, quote unquote, respected researcher, or at least has been on the circuit, pontificating at podiums around the nation, will get arrested for one thing or another that like completely shows that he completely misrepresented what he even does for a living and everything. Yeah.
But you know, knowing my brain, my thoughts immediately went to like, well, would the CIA need an asset in an adult video store? Maybe. But, you know, there's no evidence for that.
Zekel is interesting, and pretty much everyone involved in the NICAP orbit is worthy of a book on their activities in themselves, and many of them did have multiple books written about them. What you're saying, Jeff, reminds me of when I got the CIA or NSA to further release a memo that alluded to Tom Dooley's activity at a MUFON symposium. And Tom Dooley was a member of the board of directors for the Mutual UFO Network, and he was also an NSA man and a career naval officer, if I recall correctly. And there's a lot of nuance one has to understand, like Jeff's getting at with Dooley's memo that the NSA released, but he clearly had concerns about Zekel trying to manipulate him, and that like if Zach and Dooley is informing his supervisor, I was at this UFO conference, this guy's trying to open lines of communication with me, and that's all well and good, but I fear that no matter what happens, he may misrepresent later what happened. And that was pretty clear from Dooley's memo. What always intrigued me about that memo, though, was that Dooley also told his NSA supervisor, but I think there still may be, I'm paraphrasing here, but Dooley said, I think there may be possibilities for productive work. And I always wondered, what was that supposed to mean? Like, that's not something you'd tell your NSA supervisor if you meant about your UFO hobby, I wouldn't think, you know? And so, yeah, there's a lot of interesting aspects to these guys that claim they were CIA. The Washington Post, I believe it is, identified Zekel as a former NSA employee at one point. And I mean, you always got to chase footnotes and figure out who's who. How about you, Rachel? Any comments on all that?
Not at this point. Thank you.
Randy, would you like to add anything?
No, nothing yet. I think I do have some questions a bit later on in this chapter we'll get to.
Sure. Thanks for being here with us. All right, we'll continue. Coinciding with a company launch and call for investors, TTSA frontman Tom DeLonge took up the breakthroughs are imminent torch, stating, "We believe there are discoveries within our reach that will revolutionize the human experience, but they can only be accomplished through the unrestricted support of breakthrough research and innovation." Imagine having 25th century technology this century, added longtime ufology staple and TTSA co-founder Dr. Hal Puthoff. He explained that a team of passionately curious minds was assembled to reveal and decode information that can challenge the limits of traditional theory pertaining to studying unidentified aerial phenomena. Puthoff further asserted they were bringing transformative science and engineering out of the shadows. Those 2017 remarks by DeLonge and Puthoff do not appear to be aging too awfully much better than those from their overly optimistic and perhaps at times self-important 20th century predecessors. But maybe I don't know revolutionized human experience and transformative science when I see it. I do, however, still have my money in my pocket. As of this writing, it appears much of that team of passionately curious minds sought greener pastures, and the future of TTSA is very much in doubt. Prior to the TTSA creative fundraising, the Mutual UFO Network, MUFON, cut right to the chase and seemed to accept funds provided to Robert Bigelow by the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA. The controversial philanthropist and UFO world main character facilitated the arrangement as part of apparent Pentagon UFO programs. I say apparent because a great deal of the projects remain unconfirmed for the time being. Key MUFON personnel typically claim no knowledge of the source of the funds or involvement with what we now know to have been the agency originally managing the reported UFO projects, the DIA. It is also unclear if the DIA fully endorsed enrolling the services of MUFON, particularly if the feds were already in possession of so much information ripe for disclosure, but we'll just keep moving. Writers like Leslie Kean and George Knapp managed to position themselves in the midst of the disclosure dust devil on several occasions, even if their coverage may be disingenuous, in error, or more than a little responsible for perpetuating the whirlwind itself. The two, along with numerous disclosure beat reporters who followed suit, tend to promote rather credulous stories and flawed lines of reasoning in the form of what some came to consider access journalism. Such examples include Knapp's devotion to the Bob Lazar story, unquestioning portrayal of Skinwalker Ranch, and uncritical acceptance of TTSA statements and narratives while consistently showcasing the personalities involved. Knapp's defense of the dubious Lazar case is particularly vulnerable to criticism, considering the duo's claim they were each aware of a location where Lazar stashed some purportedly alien-engineered Element 115, yet they steadfastly refused to produce it. Researchers aptly noted the irony of supposed disclosure activists who, we are to believe, choose not to grace the world with the very smoking gun they demand from the powers that be. Kean's objectivity and apparent confirmation bias were called into question when she perpetuated claims of a government cover-up of the JAL 1628 UFO case. The claims were directly contradicted by testimonies of two first-hand witnesses to the alleged cover-up. They attended a meeting in which the purported cover-up directive was allegedly issued, yet they said no such statements were made. Moreover, the two indicated info was actually distributed for analysis. Kean omitted the circumstances from her account of the case, even after researchers brought them to her attention, while reportedly simultaneously obstructing communication between the researchers and her contact who claimed the cover-up was in place. Kean also made yet to be verified assertions about the ATIP, as well as fantastic claims about Chilean alleged UFOs that proved unsupported. The work of such writers as Kean and Knapp is held in high regard by many UFO enthusiasts, while others seriously question their chronic, uncritical, and incomplete reporting that often omits rather obvious discrepancies. Criticism may be most justified in the way the two present themselves as journalists, while titles such as UFO promoters seem much more accurate. Yet another noteworthy UFO disclosure activist, or at least he seems to like to think so, is Dr. Stephen Greer. The former medical doctor undertook rather extreme theatrics and questionable lines of research, ostensibly designed to facilitate wider knowledge of UFOs and their occupants. Greer's activities reportedly include bringing an entourage of armed bodyguards to a scheduled speaking engagement at the 2013 Contact in the Desert event in Joshua Tree, California. He is also known for exaggerating the significance of his interactions with public officials and charging substantial fees for workshops purported to facilitate contact with extraterrestrials, among other eyebrow-raising activities. Greer's general shtick is that the visiting ETs are friendly, but Uncle Sam wants to paint them as hostile and keep a lid on it because ET has a source of free energy. Letting the free energy cat out of the bag would loosen the government's stranglehold on many industries, Greer suggests. His outspoken activism on UFO truth, he would lead us to believe, resulted in several thwarted attempts on his life by the powers that be, thus the dramatic scene at Joshua Tree. Greer may be most infamous for his extraordinary claims which proved incorrect surrounding the Atacama skeleton and the ethical issues which arose with his and Dr. Gary Nolan's handling of the specimen. Nolan, an honored Stanford professor and researcher who obtained degrees in genetics, had a brief affiliation with To the Stars. He was also widely and confidently suspected to be a not so anonymously portrayed starry-eyed character in a Dr. Diana Walsh-Pasulka nonfiction sort of book, American Cosmic. The situation was questioned by your author, as was Nolan and Walsh-Pasulka's lack of willingness to directly address their alleged involvement in reports of security personnel monitoring and editing her statements made on podcasts. Suffice it to say, neither of the two had much to say about any of it, but I guess that's disclosure for you. Transparency often seems to only be a good thing if it's applied to the actions of others. The sincerity of Walsh-Pasulka's seemingly half-hearted effort to conceal the identities of primary characters in American Cosmic was questioned throughout segments of the UFO genre, as were the underlying motives. Back to Greer. He shoveled the coal pretty hard on the Atacama skeleton story, which he sold as pertaining to extraterrestrials. This was depicted in his 2013 crowdsource funded film Sirius, which was billed as blowing the lid off the UFO mystery. Cash contributors voiced disappointment when they had to pay to view the movie and indicated they felt double billed. Some then found the contents of the movie lacking and falling well short of its advertised lid-blowing significance. The disappointment didn't get any less bitter when Greer announced yet another film which needed funding and would, once and for all, reveal the shocking truth. It, of course, didn't. Then he did it again. Some might think tax forms show the purpose of his persistence in the face of chronic futility. In 2014, I reviewed tax information submitted to the Internal Revenue Service by the Greer-operated nonprofit corporation Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence, CSETI, which seemed to serve as the hub for his ventures. I discovered Greer reported taking no salary from CSETI, but during the 2012 tax year, CSETI reported paying some $177,000 for consultation fees to the Greer-owned Crossing Point, Inc. The amount CSETI paid the prior year, 2011, to Crossing Point was $180,360. In 2010, over $214,000 was paid from CSETI to Crossing Point. During the 3-year period reviewed, Greer's Crossing Point was paid nearly 70% of the $833,083 combined CSETI reported total income, according to 990 forms filed to the IRS. The 2012 CSETI Form 990EZ indicated the organization surrendered its nonprofit status effective January 1st, 2013. The move may have been related to bringing in so much more unrelated business income than public support that its nonprofit charity status was possibly jeopardized as defined by IRS. Surrendering the nonprofit status would then be an advisable move on Dr. Greer's part, and not bad work if you can get it. Stephen Bassett, we'll pause there before we unwrap the Bassett box, which looks very similar to the Greer box, actually. One thing that comes to mind here is the rhetorical question, okay, if it's all so stupid and just fraud and grifting, why dissect it at all? And I think that's how a lot of the population looks at this. And in a manner of speaking, they're not wrong. I mean, I once knew a systems engineer that had an interest in UFOs and ghost phenomena and, you know, just spooky stuff. And one of the things he would say to me is, I'm not going to read everything because the few things I miss that are worthwhile aren't worth the time I spend on all the stuff that's not worthwhile. And I think that's how the general population often looks at the UFO topic in general. So again, I'm going to come back to, it begins to matter as a humanitarian, it begins to matter when people get hurt, when people are being hypnotized, when they're being exploited, financially, physically, any number of ways, it begins to matter. And as the media and reporters, and as I already mentioned, it starts to matter when verifiable intelligence officers and people who are known to have had former positions in the Pentagon in past administrations start giving credibility to the topic. Then people begin to wonder why that is, and they want to know why that is. And like Jeff and I were talking about, as Tanner has brought up, as Stephen has aptly pointed out, there are mysteries involved in this of why people were doing the things they were doing. And unfortunately, it frequently becomes an argument about the reality or lack thereof of extraterrestrial spacecraft, flying saucers, interplanetary craft. And I would suggest that there are issues here that are much more interesting in their own ways, to me anyway, than those issues. And some of you cover that. Welcome, Marcin. Good to see you here. He contributed some of the slides you're seeing tonight, and I appreciate that. Jeff, would you like to comment any on, so there's Greer and all that, but what about more confounding mysteries?
Well, For me, Greer was always kind of a fringe topic, and even in UFOs, like Greer was always kind of his own thing. Like if you were part of like the more MUFON crowd, like Greer wasn't really like your thing. You ostensibly pretended to be science-based anyway. And so Greer was kind of just always fringe to me, but the longer I've been in the topic, I've moved away from the nuts and bolts mysteries to like, I'm interested why people are in this topic, why people believe what they do. And I find these more like personal and psychological and cultural ways of looking at the topic and the mysteries in it more interesting than coming to an answer whether or not there's alien spaceships out there. So I don't know if Rachel, I think, wanted to add on to that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out like how I learned about Leslie Kean like back in I want to say like around 2010 or something like that. And so when the 2017 article came out in the New York Times and I saw her name there, it was like immediately obvious to me that, oh, this is just going to be some like propaganda from people that are obviously very involved and entrenched in this and have this huge bias. But you could see interviews with Leslie Kean from around that time, like on I remember seeing her on something like the Colbert Show or something like that, or the Colbert Report, right? And it looks to just like someone who's not familiar with the topic, like she's just some like unbiased person, journalist, like who, sort of just stumbled on this. And so that's a really important point is the reason why this is so important is because if you are interested in UFOs for whatever reason, like maybe you saw UFOs or something like that, there are all these people like Keane and George Knapp who pretend to be reporters and basically work as reporters when in fact they're just completely shirking any kind of journalistic standards and straight up lying.
I think that's a great point. And I think that we would be justified in disappointment in the New York Times for not making that part of the ongoing story. That what was Keane's relationship with the subject matter prior to presenting her as an objective reporter, along with Blumenthal and the woman's name escapes me. Who was the third lady in the article? Helene Cooper.
Yeah, Helene Cooper.
Yeah. So I might as well clarify now. In 2017, the New York Times carried an article written by Leslie Kean, Ralph Blumenthal, and Helene Cooper that went really heavy with the government says there are alien spacecraft and that we have footage of it. And now some, 9 going on 10 years later, we have the usual blurry videos, dots on the horizons, things like this. And once again, as the NICAP playbook laid out in the 1960s, we had Defense Department officials and former intelligence officers saying they could vouch for it, and everybody can vouch for it. But as Rachel aptly points out, a professional reporter would require confirmation and verification to report their statements as facts rather than just their statements, and so on and so forth. And so again, this is how we slide into an argument about people that are often very passionately attached, very emotionally attached to the reality of flying saucers. I know what I saw, the paranormal, the whatever we want to call the phenomena. And there are other issues here about whether or not any of that is accurate. The fact will remain George Knapp and Bob Lazar claim to have element 115, and they damn well ain't giving it to nobody. Like that's going to remain to be an established fact, whether or not they find life on a moon of Jupiter or something like that. And these are the critical thinking skills that are required with these complexities and to go into this nuance. Allison, would you like to add anything? Or it's Stephen, you have your hand up, sure.
I was just going to go back to the discussion about whether this is a waste of time, because I often feel that way, that I'm just wasting my time. And what I always come back to is like, well, someone's got to do it. Someone's got to look into this stuff because no one else is. And I look at the money here in your book, that ran through the Greer associations, and they depend and rely on the fact that no one's going to look into it. And it must be just a great thing to be a UFO grifter, because no one's looking at following the money, following the documents. For the most part, no one's going to invest this much time to look into UFOs. No modern journalist is going to do that. And so, as Rachel said, she knew who Leslie Kean was leading up to the New York Times article. So when she read it, she already had like the context, right? The context of what this is. Most people don't, because they're not given that, because no one's doing their journalistic job. So anyway, that's why I found this book to be essential for me.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Stephen. Allison, did you want to add anything?
Sure. This just parallels so much with what I've learned about psyops and disinformation and all of that. And you had pointed out how there's a lot of nuance. You learn to look for the people, like who's saying what, and if you don't have the context, just like Rachel said, then you might not question it. But it's important to know who's saying it and potentially why. Like, who's reporting this? Who are these people representing themselves as, journalists and stuff? It just really parallels with a lot of the stuff that I've learned from like Jim Stewartson and psyops and disinformation, that it's right along with that. So, and I think it, like what Stephen said, like it's really important to look into this stuff because no one else is, because people just, if you're not interested in UFOs or any of that, then they're just like, oh, they just dismiss it. And that is probably why a lot of the grifters get away with what they get away with.
Thank you. I think it being such a fringe topic, like you and Stephen are saying, I think that makes it attractive to grifters. I also think it makes it attractive to the intelligence community. I mean, judges don't want to hear about it. Like the court system, police officers typically feel like that if somebody fell for the guru out at the cult temple, well, then maybe they had it coming and things like that. I think that even becomes of interest to the intelligence community. Go ahead, Randy.
Yeah, I was just gonna on this. Some of the questions I had were around Greer and CSETI. I'll just admit that back in the early 2000s, I was a card-carrying member of CSETI. I remember getting a big 3-ring binder of all these documents that they mailed to members, and audio cassette tape of purported UFO sounds from a crop circle, and there's all sorts of stuff like that. So I was especially interested to see these financial numbers that you had here. And kind of Stephen alluded to this, that like it's pretty financially rewarding to be one of these guys, to just create a website that gets people to go out and meditate to contact aliens, and you're now pulling in what looks like $200,000 a year. So my question really is about these numbers. It looked to me like, or it sounds like CSETI was giving the majority of its funds to Greer for consulting fees. And I guess I didn't quite understand the part about losing the nonprofit status due to um, too much business income compared to public support. So do we know what was the income for CSETI?
That's a good question. The 3 years combined was over $800,000. What I was referring to with unrelated business income, that's a term that IRS uses that factors into nonprofit organization status. See, an organization like Expanding Frontiers files the proper paperwork to be a nonprofit tax exempt organization. In order to keep that status, there's a formula for how much you take in public support, which makes you a public organization, as compared to how much you raise in what the IRS terms unrelated business income, or UBI. That would be like when you see the churches selling pumpkins or Christmas trees. That might be unrelated business income for fundraisers. So they have to have a certain percentage. I think it's at least a third of their overall revenue in an annual tax year has to be public support. For a 501c3, not necessarily a church, a 501c3 to maintain public charity status. So if you get to a point where you're making 98% of $800,000 over a 3-year period from crowdsourced films and selling films and not public support, it would be advisable if that happened. I don't know what they did, but I speculated that's what happened. So then they forfeited their tax exempt status. And see, it's a good problem to have in the grand scheme of things. You're just saying, okay, I'll pay taxes on my $800,000 collected. Never mind, we're not a nonprofit. We're clearly a for-profit corporation, so we'll pay our taxes. And it's wise to do that before challenging the IRS or someone to complain about it, or to impose penalties, or to revoke your status. But I could see from his 990 EZ form that he surrendered his nonprofit status, and I speculated that was due to his unrelated business income.
Okay, so CSETI was, like you said, selling something and making enough from it that it like dwarfed the amount of public funds, and so they had to give up the
I would strongly suspect that's why he surrendered the nonprofit status. Yes, I don't know why else you would, really.
All right, that makes sense. Thank you.
Sure. And Jeff, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say one of the problems is that even when these organizations and these grifters, as they are, when their finances get exposed, when the scam gets exposed, people just have a tendency to just kind of like reframe how they look at the whole situation. It's kind of like in religion, there's the concept that when prophecies fail, they never really fail. People just kind of reframe how they look at the prophecy so they can keep it going. And you saw this with like the TTSA, for example, when people invested all the money in this company, I guarantee you a lot of them initially thought it was going to be an investment. They might see some return on it. When it turned out to be a scam, you saw people's views change on Twitter and online, where they're basically like, oh, well, I'm just happy to have supported the movement. And I never actually believed it was an investment. Like, I thought it was more of a donation. And so people just kind of like reframe their beliefs about like how they look at that stuff. I mean, just look at Greer, he just, pulled all this. People continue to give him money. I guarantee people that gave, are still giving him money now. And so, unfortunately, even exposing this stuff, which is an important thing to do, I think we need to expose, like a lot of these financial grifters and scam artists and whatnot. But when you're a believer, a lot of times it doesn't even really matter. You just kind of, you keep going.
Yeah, and it does become married to the belief, like it, and it really should be separated. The activities of any given researcher or writer should be questioned and verified separate from what a person's personal beliefs are. And good point. And go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. Yeah, kind of. Jeff said a lot of it, but it really piggybacks off of what he was just touching on. But the fact that it's the nonprofit status was so inconsequential that Greer was willing to give it up because it just doesn't even matter. You don't even need to have the guise of being a nonprofit at this point. Profit isn't only okay; it's expected. It's expected that you're going to be crowdsourcing or having a crypto or a meme coin or be vying for $1 million government contracts, affecting legislation to try and create those contracts. It's accepted that money is part of the game for all kinds of other reasons other than profit, right? It's a necessity to get towards disclosure, so it's okay.
Good point. Anyone else want to add anything? Go ahead, Tanner.
Well, I was wondering, I don't really keep up with Stephen Greer these days, but I have to assume he's still crowdfunding his documentaries. Is that the case?
Does anyone know?
I was just looking at his website. This prompted me to look him up again. And yeah, I believe so. And also
That's
on
incredible.
the event calendar, there was he was offering like this week-long come visit, and he'll share the details, his life lessons about everything he's learned. And I was looking at the cost, and it was like $7,500 for the
Oh,
week,
jeez.
not including hotels or accommodations or meals or anything like that. So he's still pulling in the money.
I caught his last documentary on Tubi, and which is where it belongs. It should be added for free. But there's so much AI usage. I'd have to think I'd feel like what did I even pay for if all this was just generated?
Yeah, those are good points and good things to raise. His fees were extremely high to attend his workshops and his retreats, where he told people they were in communications with extraterrestrials and things. I also respect you, Randy, for saying that you followed him at one point. I think that's how most people get to their critical assessments of the circumstances. As many have said, it's reasonable if Leslie Kean is being carried in the New York Times to think that's a credible article until you know Leslie's history. And I appreciate all that you guys have shared.
Yeah, I will just add that I never did go on one of his outings way back when. I never did meet him or go on any of the outings, and these days I'm pretty glad.
Yeah. Okay, we'll continue with the end of chapter 1. The disclosure party and form the Paradigm Research Group, a lobbying initiative or something to that effect to end the truth embargo. To the best of my knowledge, the group officially and functionally consists of no one other than himself. His efforts include such projects as the 2008 Million Facts on Washington, in which he attempted to inspire followers to inundate the incoming Obama administration with faxes, emails, and phone calls demanding the release of UFO files. Bassett probably made his loudest noise with the 2013 citizen hearing on disclosure. 6 former members of Congress were paid $20,000 apiece to sit in a mock hearing in which they spent a few days listening to dozens of people of varying levels of credibility, notoriety, and infamy provide testimony on UFOs. The above-mentioned Stephen Greer was among the presenters, and evening activities included a screening of his film Sirius. Richard Dolan was among the presenters at the citizen hearing and is known for what his followers seem to believe is his fight to pry the UFO truth from the government. At the hearing, he rather shamelessly trotted out a filmed interview of an aged man referred to as Anonymous. The man allegedly worked for the CIA and observed many astounding ET-related sights during his employment at Area 51. The statements, dubbed a deathbed testimony, were heavily implied to be motivated by the man's desire to tell the world what he knew and avoid taking the stories to his looming grave. Trouble was, as I covered in 2013, Linda Moulton Howe had long since interviewed Anonymous. His completely unverified story was no less than 15 years old at the time it was implied to be urgent and showcased by Dolan and Bassett at the citizen hearing on disclosure. In preparation for my above-referenced 2013 article on the situation, I offered both Dolan and Bassett an opportunity to comment and explain what they would say to people who might question the tactic. Neither responded. Doubt was further cast on Dolan's judgment and motives when he participated in the Roswell slides fiasco, a chain of events involving slides which depicted what was actually a mummified Native American child, but were promoted as images of an ET. Dolan spoke at the dubious Be Witness event, a public rollout of the slides sponsored by Jaime Maussan, and which time Dolan called the slides compelling. He also vouched for the research skills of the questionable crew promoting the story, who at absolute best utterly failed to pursue the most profoundly obvious of explanations. Many wondered how Dolan, who claims to be qualified to penetrate and analyze complex issues related to UFOs and national security, could sincerely be so inept. Shortly after the Be Witness purported big reveal of the slides, the truth came shining through and the story was completely dismantled due to the quality work of the Roswell slides research group. Within hours of the event, a team of volunteer researchers was well on its way to competently analyzing the slides, high-resolution images of which the promoters had previously withheld and supposedly been unable to accurately interpret for years. As stated, the slides were conclusively shown to depict a deceased Native American child. Dolan's stock continued to dip with other instances of seemingly unquestioning acceptance of fantastic stories that should test the patience of even the most credulous UFO fan. He more recently vigorously fanned the flames of an ill-conceived tale with extremely loose connections between dots, all ultimately designed to prove what, in UFO circles, is known as the core story. Saucer crashes, alien bodies, and all that. A word to the wise. If an argument relies heavily on speculation, it doesn't prove a point. The incarnation in question of this version of the core story involves hearsay and alleged statements attributed to the purportedly in the know Admiral Thomas R. Wilson, and was referred to by Dolan as the UFO leak of the century. The story was, of course, amplified by George Knapp, since it included reference to Eric Davis and others of Skinwalker and TTSA notoriety. For those particularly interested, writer Billy Cox reported how Wilson repeatedly denied any validity to the rumors, among other problematic aspects of this Shaggy Dog story. It is rather fascinating how the UFO disclosure concept stays propped up so sturdily. Back on January 8, 1999, Art Bell hosted UFO Disclosure 99 on Coast to Coast AM. Stephen Bassett was an integral part of the show, and other guests included Stephen Greer, Richard Hoagland, and Joe Firmage. It should be noted that so many of these UFO activists somehow manage to endlessly sell urgency. Many have been personally ringing an alarm of imminent disclosure for decades. The highest hurdle for Bassett to clear indeed became the fact that deadlines of his recurring insinuations and outright predictions came and went unfulfilled. And he made a lot of insinuations and predictions. Similar can be said of history's many UFO personalities who donned the disclosure cape to promise all-telling government revelations to an eagerly awaiting UFO world. It may get tough to perpetually conjure disclosure urgency, but it is obviously quite possible. New generations and followers continue to find it an irresistible draw while taking roles as both movement leaders and supporters. For some, there may be a lack of awareness of the history of futility, while the dedication of others may be grounded in stubbornness, wishful thinking, questionable motives, or any number of such circumstances. The UFO intoxicated masses just keep coming, and there is always a supplier to meet the demand, if not create it. Let's dial the clock back from the current head-spinning pace and return to the early days of the modern UFO steeplechase. Though absent internet and podcasts, the pioneers were not without urgency and drama, far from it. Our group of focus formed in Washington, D.C. in the 1950s. Mystery and curiosity surrounded the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena from its very inception. Many challenges would plague the organization, but public interest in its affairs was usually not among them. This was apparently due in part to the public's fascination with flying saucers, an occurrence which was driven by several factors, most certainly including media attention. After considerable investigation, I have become thoroughly convinced many NICAP members were sincere and effective researchers, even if unaware of their biases at times. Whatever games may have been afoot, there were indeed people in NICAP genuinely interested in a UFO mystery for better or worse. They believed their work was important, and they considered themselves to be pioneers of a sort. In some manners of speaking, perhaps they were. In other instances, motives are more in question, as is research accuracy at times. NICAP experienced highs, lows, success, and failure, reportedly amassing some 14,000 members at one point. For some context, the Mutual UFO Network currently claims on its website to have about 4,000 worldwide members. Among the most notable aspects of the NICAP legacy is the UFO evidence, brought to life by editor Richard Hall. The 1964 report consists of some 200,000 words of UFO investigations. It embodies what NICAP felt was its 750 most compelling cases from the more than 5,000 contained in its files. The UFO evidence was provided to Congress, and more than 10,000 copies were disseminated to scientific research organizations, government agencies, universities, military installations, and libraries. While the relevance of the material could certainly be debated, the report offered a tangible starting point for discussions and a realized achievement for investigators of its day. So what happened between NICAP's inception, a 1960s heyday of public interest, soaring membership, reports of CIA infiltration, the org's decline, and its eventual 1980s demise? To better understand the rise and fall of NICAP and events of cultural and social significance along the way, let's start by exploring the beginnings. That takes us to the U.S. Capitol. The year was 1956. Any comments? Sharon, you have anything?
Leaving us on a cliffhanger.
They left us on a cliffhanger 70 years later, I can.
Right.
So I have some comments about the UFO witness, Anonymous, that was interviewed by Dolan. Since I know a little bit about this, since I was the guy that released his real name, Oscar Wolf, to the public several years ago, since I had the opportunity of knowing his son-in-law, which you can actually see in the video, pushing him in the wheelchair. And I learned some interesting things about the kind of the background of that interview. An interview that Dolan would later claim that Linda Moulton Howe pushed him into, and he hadn't done any research on beforehand to kind of backtrack a bit out of it. Another interesting side bit about that interview is that it was filmed by Jeremy Corbell. It's one of the first things he did in the UFO topic way back in the day. But so this guy, Oscar Wolf, supposedly was a military man and then worked for the CIA later on in his life. It turns out he was never actually in the military. His older brother was in the military. Even his sister was in the military back in the day. But he was never in the military. He had a proclivity telling sensational stories apparently throughout his life, according to his son-in-law. Had a large UFO kind of like library. And as you point out, like Linda Moulton Howe first interviewed this guy in the 90s. So like he'd been talking to him for a while, and this guy kind of always had an interest in the UFO topic. Maybe it was his deathbed confession. Well, the real truth is the guy lived for another 2 years. And according to his son-in-law, it's because he refused to follow the dietary and lifestyle restrictions that his doctors gave him. Otherwise, he could have lived much longer. But he kind of refused to give up the foods and the things that he enjoyed, and so ended up dying in a couple of years. But he was never on his deathbed at the time of this so-called deathbed confession. So it's So that's some interesting tidbits about that I thought I'd share.
Thank you. I know when I touched base with Linda Moulton Howe in 2013, and she would not criticize the tactic by Dolan and Bassett, and she wouldn't come off of the validity of her, at that time, anonymous witness. But as you're suggesting, Jeff, it was obvious to me that you've had 15 years to get this guy's military records, to do FOIA requests, like Barry Greenwood helped Simone Mendez with. You can help someone do their own FOIA requests, get their own records. And if you haven't done, like, you haven't moved the story at all in 15 years, that suggested to me that it's difficult to give benefit of the doubt. Let me put it that way. It suggests you know where the story would move if you took it further. That was my thinking, and thanks for sharing that. I didn't know his identity had ever been conclusively put out in the public. Thank you, Jeff.
Yeah, I actually I met his son. His son-in-law is big into UFOs. This is an active member of MUFON here in Oregon, and that's actually how I met the guy. And they both were into UFOs for like a very, very long time. And his son-in-law is actually kind of a fairly big, I guess, regional kind of pastor in the area, like a preacher guy, but he also has a huge UFO interest. But yeah, Oscar Wolf, that's the guy's name, with two F's, WOLFF. Oscar J. Wolf, I believe. Yeah.
Go ahead, Green Street.
Yeah, I was regarding that story about the quote unquote anonymous guy and Dolan kind of passing it off as some big exclusive, right? In DC, this is new, right? And no one in the public's going to know the wiser, much less your average newsman is going to say, you know, Washington Post isn't going to go, wait a minute, Linda Moulton Howe revealed this guy like years ago. Like, no one's going to actually know that backstory, right? And so we just saw Robert Salas just do another media tour, and all the media like treated it as if it was this new story. And it was like just 2-3 years ago, they did the same exact thing. It's this cyclical, they get away with it because every time it's resurfaced, it seems like a new revelation. The thing that's right around the corner. And the reason why education, what drives me at least is the idea of educating the public to know those red flags of when they're being shafted, essentially. You know, everyone here sees it in the media. They see it all the time, where it's just this cyclic, the same story told by the same people, the same exact way. Right. And I think that we can learn a lot about, when I was reading your book, for example, I was just jaw dropping. It's like the same exact things, the same exact way happening.
Yeah, as I mentioned about an hour or so ago, that's really what took it from being a blog post to a book. Was like this is like a playbook. Like, this isn't just coincidences and similarities. This is like, as we'll find in the coming chapters, Donald Kehoe's real talent was public relations. And he seemed to come to identify UFO investigation as lobbying Congress. And he managed to get UFO hearings on the congressional agenda. And it was just astounding to me how much I was seeing that again in recent years with people that were primarily acting as press agents. And if they're being given the front page of the paper for their announcements and event advertisements, I mean, I'm sure everyone here experienced walking in a public restaurant, maybe a government office, and there on the television you see in the background there's a story about UAP, UFOs, a battleship that's fighting with UFOs or something between 2017 and like 2025. And yeah, the similarities to NICAP were amazing, as we'll see. I still have never decided what I really think Kehoe was or wasn't doing. I sometimes think it changed from week to week or month to month or year to year as well. But who else would like to share?
Yeah, I just wanted to unfortunately I made all my interesting notes on the next chapter. But yeah, I just wanted to underline how like morally repugnant some of these people are, like taking a mummy of an indigenous child and passing it off as an alien. Like just it's just awful. I just had to say that.
It was. I can tell you too. I was fairly active online during that fiasco. And at that time, we were pretty much hanging out online at blogs like Google Blogs. And the arguments and the posts would be in the comments of someone's blog. Like they might do an article about the latest thing from the Roswell Slides group, and there might be 200 comments at Kevin Randall's blog arguing about, well, why don't they show us this? Why don't they show us that? And it was insane, the extent that, yeah, I mean, someone mentioned when prophecy fails earlier, it was insane, the extent that people weaved this belief around a slide. A slide that was reportedly found by a cleaning person in someone's garage, and they proceeded to link this through a series of Shaggy Dog stories to, it seems like they were in Roswell at the time. It seems like they have connections to the military. And then you have the influx of people that already have dubious reporting histories that will frame anything as a positive ET narrative. And it was supposed to be the next big reveal. And within hours of finally sharing the slide publicly in high resolution, it was conclusively shown to be a Native American child, not only because you could read the placard, but members of the Roswell Slides research group who were not just skeptics, but people interested in accuracy, even contacted some museums they expected might have had further information and conclusively established the location this would have even been in, and that the museum is like, yeah, that looks like the display we had, and we can compare it to this. And I mean, they completely dismantled it within hours of the rollout, when the rollout had been built up to for years. And so again, we have the circumstance where, are we to believe the researchers are sincerely that incompetent, is a difficult pill to swallow.
And we still see that today with people like Corbell and Knapp, and when they say they've got these amazing videos and that they've had them for a year or two and that they've been researching them, but then the second they get released on social media, they get debunked within sometimes 5 minutes or within hours. And so the cycle just continues to repeat the same kind of crazy stories. I had a quick question. Correct me if I'm wrong. wasn't there actually slides? So there's the one of the mummy, but also in other slides that were never actually shown, showed other display cases from the museum, and had they looked at the other slides, it would have been obvious it was actually like a museum that they were looking at.
That could very well be. As the story went, a man who knew the people that cleaned out a house said that the slides were collected from a house cleaning and everything took off from there. Yeah, so it could very well be that that would be the obvious first thing is to look through the other slides. But it's really an example, too, of having those UFO binders that we talk about sometimes, that if a person weren't reading it on a UFO blog, or they weren't predisposed to seeing everything through the lens of aliens or spaceships, suffice it to say an archaeologist would look at that and would see a small humanoid. They would see, and that's why I say it was profoundly obvious explanations, that you can see a rib cage, and I mean, there's 2 arms, there's 2 legs. I mean, Occam's razor doesn't have to go very far to find the high hand to beat. Like, you gotta, and we know you can never, from a photograph, a slide, an image, you can never prove what it is physiologically. You can't do tests on it, you can't extract DNA. But the research group that challenged the claims was able to even locate the museum that said, yeah, that looks like our display there. And I think they came up with all kinds of specific information about the deceased child. Yes.
I was just gonna say, and maybe this kind of leads up to your question about what Kehoe's role in all this was, especially as like a public relations guy. I think he must have been very good at it, given Lindbergh's reputation is relatively good, and it's come out that he was probably into some stuff that the American public at large wouldn't have been into. So maybe there was, not to say that there was something like that going on with NICAP, but just sort of his skill as a public relations guy could, there's reasons to bring that into play.
Yes, there are. I agree. Director Hoover thought so too, as we'll see as we get into the chapters on Kehoe's FBI files. And Tanner, you kind of bring me to something I wanted to share about the title of the book. As I talked to people that were some of them were around during the NICAP days. Some of them knew people that were around during the NICAP days. Erica Lukes, of course, was very helpful with her archives of UFO pioneers and NICAP members that I could look through their stuff. Barry Greenwood, as I've mentioned, shared NICAP archives with me that were extremely helpful. And as I read through this stuff and spoke with people and exchanged emails with the UFO side of the people, I found that they often didn't really seem to understand my interests. Like they just didn't seem to have a frame of reference for someone that wasn't interested in flying saucer reports. And I would I would get people referencing, you'll want to put this one in. Here was one of the best. Have you looked through the 750 reports? Have you? And they just didn't seem to get that I wasn't interested in witness narrations about things they saw in the sky. And something I felt that I did see through these people as I read their works and their published books and the reports that they made and things like that. I felt like that they wanted to be involved in something that was important. They wanted to make a difference. They identified this as relevant. And the NICAP investigator that had his survey forwarded to the FBI, they were telling the witness, this may be something that, you know, even matters to future generations and all. And they clearly wanted it to be important, and they got really seduced by that idea and were willing to give in to their confirmation bias and believe that if this intelligence officer tells me he believes in UFOs, that became the way they measured sincerity and trustworthiness of other people and intelligence officers. But making the title of the book wasn't just about the UFO people that went astray. I also developed empathy for the intelligence community. And in my research of who are these people in the Office of Policy Coordination and who worked for the CIA and who were the first directors and what were they doing, I came across young men that were privileged and went to Ivy League schools and seemed like other kids that didn't want to go to college, that didn't know what to tell their parents, that they were into practical jokes and pranks. One of the guys that worked with Joseph Bryan even had a book written about him, about his epic practical jokes and pranks he would pull. And then when I came to Louis Pinky Thompson, it seemed like one interpretation would be it's almost tragic that this man's father was a decorated war hero that was on the cover of Time and was deeply involved in Texaco Oil, and Pinky Thompson was born into privilege and wealth and had a great deal of money and resources, really for being lucky and being born where he was. And as I understood his story, he went to the intelligence services and said, how can I help? What can I do? And wanted to do something meaningful, I think. Well, you know, like this was an era that the FBI was respectable, the CIA was respected, and men of wealth and privilege and power, it was patriotic and respectable to be helpful to the intelligence agencies. And Pinky Thompson, by all accounts, ended up an MK Ultra bagman in Europe, is what he went on to do, at least in part. And I think what happens when people go into employment or volunteering as an asset for an intelligence agency, like all the rest of us, they are subject to be exploited by an employer. They're subject to be used. Their loyalties are subject to be taken advantage of. And in this whole story, again, about how it's almost not really even about UFOs, I saw a bunch of wayward sons and daughters that just wanted to do something that mattered and that would be meaningful. And we're often open to exploitation when we're willing to believe people, will help us do that. Any comments on any of that?
I just want to take umbrage with it. I do think it's a great title for the reasons you just laid out, but I have to take umbrage with you saying it's not the Kansas song because you were never a fan. And as a native Kansas son, we have to respect the only band that ever came from the state.
I actually am a Kansas fan, Tanner, and not only Wayward Sons, but Point of No Return was very good work as well. Yes. Well, again, I want to thank all of you for joining me. It's been my privilege. I'm honored that you're here. I hope that you'll join me again next Wednesday night as we continue through the book. And if you're watching this on YouTube, you can get involved in the discussion with us. I will have links and my email address in the video description below, and you can get involved with us and read and discuss with us. And thank you all for joining me. This has been Jack Brewer with Expanding Frontiers Research. Visit us at expandingfrontiersresearch.org. Support us on Patreon, and you can also make one-time donations if you would like at our GoFundMe page, all of which you'll find in the video description below. And thank you again all for joining me.